Welcome to Larkin-Gowan Insights, accountancy and business advice for all, a series that gives you bite-sized tips and guidance on tax, funding, legislation, reforms and much more. With case studies, business advisory and sector specials and even interviews, our team of experts are committed to helping you navigate the world of accounting and finance with a variety of presenters from across our specialisms. So, let's get on with today's show.
Today's episode within our Life Cycle of the Business series is on growth. Now you're an established business and how to look at the growth strategies going forward. We're joined by our colleague, Will Gibbs. Will, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, Megan and Alanah. Thank you for having me on. My name is Will Gibbs and I sit within our business team at Larkin-Gowan, and I specialise on helping businesses grow.
Will, there'll be many business owners listening in today where they are part of an established business. They're now looking at growth and how they're going to achieve that. What are the first steps of any business wanting to grow?
I think it's a question we get very often from our clients. And the first step that I would always say is do we understand where the business currently sits? How well do we know the current position and the breakup of what actually is delivering our results? So key things to consider are areas like turnover. You'll be doing your statutory accounts, and at the end of the year, I'm sure you'll know what your turnover for the year is. But do you actually know the breakdown of that by your product or service, all the way down to the profit? What actually drives home the profits for the business? Are you spending a lot of time focusing on certain products or services which perhaps deliver high turnover but don't deliver a lot of profit, or vice versa? So for me, the first question is always, how good is the current position and how good is the understanding of the business owner of where they want to get from? Because when we talk about growth, the first question is, where are we growing from?
Perfect, exactly. And I think it's important to note as well the key part that digital software plays in this. So for example, Xero, you can track your different products and the sales through those, can't you? And you can also get the live data out of those accounting software packages, which helps you view the now.
100%. The days of having to record down in books what you've sold and how much of it was are long gone, and the ability now to be able to just pull up on your phone or your laptop or computer and see live access data of where your sales sit. And if you are using good platforms and using them correctly, the split and analysis you can pull out of that is pretty integral to when you look behind a business, and particularly when you start talking about growth.
You say that. I was actually reading some meeting notes earlier that were handwritten, and I had the piece of paper pretty close trying to figure out what the number was, and I thought to myself, thank goodness we've moved away from the cash book days.
well, I know at Larkin-Gowan we have a big medical team, and the doctor's notes for accounting records can also be a textbook challenge. So yeah, I'm pleased that the days of handwriting, my handwriting's no better either.
So you've got your now, you're looking at your sales mix and your products, but where can you go from there? How do you know how good your now is and what you want to get to?
So I think the key question there is where are we trying to get to? If we know where the business sits today, and we know as motivated and ambitious business owners, we want to grow and move forwards. But what does that actually mean? How far do we want to grow? And what are we talking about when we look at growth? So a lot of business owners will fixate, rightly or wrongly, around turnover. It's probably the easiest number to look at and understand from your business. So you will see a lot of business owners that when they talk about growth, what they're referring to is how can we sell more, which is completely fine. And how much more? Because we look each year at inflation results and targets. But does that actually mean that your growth in turnover is the business growing, or does it just mean that you are moving in line with the wider economy? So actually understanding what's realistic is a key next step. So in building those targets, ideally, we always encourage business owners to have some form of relatively reliable forecast or budget for the period that they're looking at. Typically, we'd be talking a year or maybe a couple of years. Whilst forecasts and budgets always have their limitations, because being realistic about it, you can never predict the future, so you're never going to get it right. Forecasts are always either lucky or wrong. They are very important in tracking how you're actually performing relative to your targets. If you don't have a forecast or budget and you just say you want to grow, is £1 worth of growth, does that mean you've achieved what you wanted to do? Or is actually you're talking about higher numbers than that? So understanding a forecast for where you want to get to, and then having it in a way that you can monitor, ideally on a monthly or regular basis, so you can track your performance against the target, is a key. Whilst it doesn't necessarily cause the growth, it allows you to actually see what's going on and understand what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so if I'm no longer Mystic Meg and I need some help with actually coming up with those budgets and forecasts, people can use, now you're an established business, you can go back and look at possibly trends that you've had previously. How would people kind of look at budgeting going forward, targets going forward?
100%. I think we are naturally inclined, particularly as accountants that are super exciting and always focus on the numbers. We often look backwards and look at historic results and think, last year we grew by this amount. So therefore, when we look forwards, we think, well, if we target growth of the same, there's some sort of logic behind that. Now, that is a perfectly reasonable approach, and looking at trends over a period of time to try and steer you where you think you might be going over the next year or two does hold a lot of logic. However, what we've seen, particularly in recent times, is that the past doesn't dictate the future that well. The obvious scenario to bring up and probably mention is COVID. So nobody saw that coming, and the lockdowns associated with it. And as a result, anyone who looks back now at their results, particularly in the early 2020s, will not really indicate where the business is going to go in the mid 2020s, so and beyond. So that clearly, looking backwards, does help, but is massively limited. I would normally encourage, whilst that might be a starting point, to look at what the current expectations are. So if you are a business that takes forward orders or has a pipeline for long-term projects or has repeat customers that we know come through each year, all of these things can help steer where we actually anticipate the next 12 months to go. Obviously, the further forwards we look, the harder that becomes. Not many businesses have the luxury of seeing what their sales are likely to be over the next 3, 4, 5 years. Some do, but not many.
I think it's also important as well to note that when you're doing a forecast or a budget, it doesn't necessarily have to stay the same for the whole year. You can review that halfway through. For example, some of my clients will get halfway through and then they'll look back on the previous 6 months and then incorporate some of that in the next 6 months. So I think, do you want to just talk on the benefit of doing that as well?
It's very sensible. The only catch is we don't want to update our forecasts continuously, because they then don't actually become a forecast. They become just a comparison of what we're actually doing. That said, definitely updating is a key and clear action to take when it looks at reporting growth and seeing where you go. 6 months is quite a reasonable time frame. Quarterly is another one we see with a lot of clients, to look back and see how they're doing against their budget and then revise. And I think all of it stems back to when you first make that budget or forecast, you're trying to predict the future. We're relying on Mystic Meg to come up with her ideas. So the more we can move forwards, the more we can look at actual data to remove some of the mystique or glass ball optimism that we're trying to build in. So updating is key, and also you don't know what's around the corner, so it does have the added benefit of being more reliable the further through you go.
I suppose you say that you don't know what's coming around the corner. For anyone who might be maybe a construction business that's listening to this, perhaps they've entered into a contract and actually they're going to see huge growth and they need to look at the figures below the turnover. So, how are they going to actually resource that? What can we help people with, and what other considerations do people need to have when they're growing that turnover figure, that top line? What's the impact on the figures below it?
So this is where historic data becomes a lot more useful. So I have my reservations about when you look at turnover, how reliable the historic results are. However, typically as a business grows, the cost breakdown to deliver that turnover is probably going to be broadly in line. What I mean by that is if you are a business doing turnover of £100 and it costs you in staff and raw materials or equipment, it costs you £5 to deliver that. As the business grows, you're going to need probably the same proportion or a similar proportion of those costs to enable you to achieve the turnover. And looking historically at the makeup of your costs and the percentage of turnover they make up is a really good way of steering that once we hit growth and hit this turnover of however much we want over the next 12 months, what costs are we expecting to see behind that? And then from those costs, you can work out what does that actually mean. So if my staff costs are going to go up by 50%, because that's going to enable me to grow my turnover, then 50% increase in staff costs probably means I'm going to need some more headcount in the business. So how much does that actually equate to? And how can I then start recruiting and attracting those staff members? It's clear that on the cost front, historic results massively important. And you don't have to follow them by the letter. It just gives you a guide that as you build your forecast, you can look through and plan backwards.
Yeah, so anyone listening to this, they might be a large business or they might be a smaller business, but it's key for whatever size you are, isn't it? To plan ahead, look forward. Can you actually meet that demand? Because now you're an established business, you've got a bit of a reputation and you want to keep that, don't you? You want to make sure you can fulfill all of those orders that you might be promising. I suppose communicating with your people, if it's kind of service based, making sure that they're ready to take on the additional work.
If we've covered understanding where your business is to start with and now looked at forecasts, probably this stems on nicely, Megan, from your question onto maybe a third area, which is understanding what the limitation or the limiting factor of the business is.
Yeah.
So exactly as you say, it may be some businesses are in a position where they can increase the demand or turnover relatively easily. They can sort of flood their market by just offering more, but actually maintaining quality and being able to deliver on those promises might be particularly challenging. So a key there is understanding what is it that actually is prohibiting the business from growth. In that scenario, we looked at perhaps maybe people. If you can increase turnover, but you don't have somebody there to be able to produce that product or provide that service, then signing all these customers up and saying we're going to come and do this work for you isn't actually going to be able to deliver long-term growth for the business. It might be very short-term, look good, but suddenly the wheels will fall off when you haven't got the resource to be able to deliver on it. Other key limiting factors might be around sort of the flip side, where we look at sales. So some businesses spend a lot of time, and business owners spend a lot of time and energy in trying to drive home more sales, and they actually have already planned and built the platform to be able to deliver on those sales. But it's a lot easier to go out and say, I'm going to sign up 10 new customers today than it is to actually go and do that. Yeah. Or it could be cash. That's probably the third biggest one that I think we see from a lot of our clients. Actually having the ambition and understanding that to grow, we need to open a new site or buy some new equipment, or whatever it might be. And actually the reason why we can't go and do that today is because we don't have the cash in bank to be able to afford to go and do that. So I think understanding what your limiting factor is massively important to enabling you to actually achieve the growth targets that you set out in your forecast.
And we spoke about sales and a business's costs, but also looking at that limitation of cash, it's also important for businesses to look at, for example, their cash flow and their expected outgoings. Megan, you touched on like a construction business that might have entered a contract. Presumably, they'll have their estimated costs, so then they can bring that into a cash flow and start to look at what they're expecting in, what they're expecting to go out, and whether they actually can fund this growth.
Definitely a key area to consider. I think the old adage of turnover is vanity, profit is sanity, but cash is king is getting more and more apparent, particularly in the, I suppose, more challenging trading conditions we've probably seen over the last 12 months or so. So definitely cash is a key area to consider. And ultimately, if we had all of the money in the world, then probably the other limiting factors would go away, i.e., if you're restricted by not having enough people in your business, but you have unlimited funds, well, you could always just turn around and pay everyone a fortune. You'll probably have a queue out the door of people wanting to join the business. So arguably, every limiting factor does stem back to cash in some form. So 100% understanding the cash flow requirements of a business, particularly through growth. So I suppose if I pick further, Alanah, on that scenario with a construction business, is that typically the equipment investment required for most construction businesses as they grow can be quite sizable and chunky.
Yeah,
So
manufacturing businesses as well.
exactly. So equipment for these types of businesses is sort of vastly expensive. So turning around and just, buying new trucks, tractors, equipment, factories is not cheap. And you don't have to do it every year. They don't happen as regularly as that. But you do have to budget in, okay, how are we going to be able to afford that when we need it? We might be able to grow a little bit this year based on the resources we already have. But if we don't factor into that, we need to stockpile some form of financial power to be able to go and acquire what we need next to continue this trajectory. Then you will come unstuck when you reach the next level.
Definitely. And for example, if you're stuck in a contract, you get partway through, you're not finished, and you run out of funds, you're mid-contract. You're gonna have to then look at other ways to get that money in, and that's when you can start to get expensive financing come into play, and you've got the interest costs, finance charges that come with that, and then you've then got additional costs that are coming off of your sales.
There are many ways you can raise finance. There are lots of options in terms of loans and what they're secured against, and different providers at different rates. But fundamentally, yes, as soon as you try and raise any debt finance, it's going to incur costs, which is going to put further strain on the business. So you have to weigh into consideration what are the results likely to deliver from this investment, and do they outweigh the costs and risks associated with perhaps the debt that we're talking about. And if they don't add up, if the numbers don't make sense, then I would always be advising that doesn't sound like a sensible business decision. Let's find an alternative route. There's something else we can do. There's another way we could maybe achieve the same end result, or a different way of structuring this to be able to deliver what we need. So we don't just have to walk into the first option that came to mind.
And these are all relevant points, aren't there? For if you're sitting in the board meeting, you're trying to come up with your forward forecasts and your budgets. It's important to start thinking about these issues that you might face and the impact that they're going to have on your forecast, rather than just applying, for example, an inflationary rate. If you know things are going to come up, then the point of forecasting is when you should start thinking about pulling those in.
And I always encourage to try and challenge, if you have set a forecast within your business, is challenge each other or yourself on what that actually means. So exactly as you say, I think that we inherently like to set targets that we know or think we are going to achieve, because then we get the satisfaction of, haven't I done a good job because I've delivered on what I thought we were going to. And I don't knock that. We probably do that ourselves in our business as well. But if you can actually set yourself a target which pushes you and is aspirational, realistic, but aspirational, then it will give you the platform to drive home growth. typically the most successful businesses I think we see, or certainly I see on a regular basis, probably never hit the targets that they set for themselves. They might come close, hopefully, but because they have the ambition, they always put it just slightly out of reach to keep on stretching themselves to go further, as opposed to the businesses which grow in line with inflation. And that's not to say that doesn't represent success, because for some businesses, depending on the environment they're operating in, actually standing still can be a great success. But as we're focusing today a lot on growth, and a lot of the clients I deal with is focused on growth, typically we'd say standing still is not achieving growth, but not necessarily a failure.
So you talk about setting those targets and stretching yourself a little bit. So as the accountant, I suppose a lot of our clients, we then have regular catch-ups with them and we hold them to account. Okay, last time you said you're going to do this. Have you done that? So what other support could a business owner look to get?
First and foremost, it's monitoring. I think that's the biggest key. So if you've set yourself a target, also set the parameters of when am I going to look at how I'm doing relative to that target. And at that point is then, who am I going to look at this with? It might be that in your existing business structure, you have a lot of key individuals and contacts that are well trusted and all understand the business and the ins and outs. And when it comes to reviewing these forecasts and tracking performance, you have enough voices in the room to bounce around. Outside of that, though, we'd always recommend having professional contacts, but also just a network of similar businesses and business owners or people in similar positions that you can speak to. I think it's clear that regardless of how successful people are at running their businesses, when you only see your business, it becomes very hard to be able to understand what else is going on externally and how is everybody else dealing with these problems or opportunities that I'm faced with. 100% as the accountants, we would definitely recommend come and speak to an accountant. But I'm sure there are lots of other professional service providers that would also have a similar view and of people that would be a good sounding board. The key is having people you can trust, having people that you speak to regularly, and having people that understand what you're trying to do with the business and understand what the results and numbers behind that actually mean.
And you've spoke about having an insight and being motivated by your forecasts and not just setting ones that you can tick off, but ones that you actually need to stretch to achieve. But I think it's important to mention as well about communication. So talking about the forecast with, for example, the key trusted individuals which you've touched on, so sales managers, for example, telling them what you're actually wanting to achieve, because they'll then have that buy-in. You're creating the positive culture within the workplace and everyone is coming together as a core group to try and achieve those targets as well.
I think sharing the weight of leadership is massively important. And when you run your own business, it becomes quite a big challenge, or what we see from our clients is it becomes quite a big challenge to make every decision and lead everything yourself. And forecasting growth and targets goes in line with that. If you are the only person that knows what your target is or why you're trying to get there, then you will ultimately wear all the responsibility and pressures of whether or not you're on target or going to hit them. If you can chunk it down, it doesn't mean you have to be fully transparent with everybody in the business by any means, but if you can chunk it down to the relevant areas for each other member of the business and set them their target, and everyone is working towards the same goal, what you've enabled yourself to do is I suppose deleverage yourself and a lot of that responsibility, because it's not easy if you try and wear it all yourself.
No, definitely not. We've spoken in earlier podcasts about business owners wearing all sorts of different hats, for example, playing all the different key parts. But also, if you are, for example, a sales manager, you're not necessarily going to know about the costs or not going to know everything about the costs of the business. So you won't necessarily know when you've got price locks, when you've got discounts agreed for the next period, which will also play a part in those forecasts. So you almost can't really do it by yourself.
100%. And I think that's where that's the part of the role that I suppose I probably enjoy the most, is the fact that we are privileged as accountants to see hundreds, thousands of clients across the business. And whilst we don't have an active day-to-day role within most of those businesses, we still see their results, and we still have the conversations with those running the business to understand what it is that's going on behind the scenes. And all of that knowledge leaves us in a position that even if we didn't have the natural business acumen or experience of running businesses, what we've seen is different scenarios and lots of different success stories and failures. And that knowledge is something that is so easy to pass on if we're given the opportunity to have the conversations with our clients. And we're not the only ones. So bankers and insurers, lawyers are in similar positions. And is one of the great things about working in professional services is being able to see lots of different businesses from different industries and being able to relay the messages of where things might look like a bit of an outlier compared to perhaps what other people are doing.
So, well, if we put it into practical terms now, and we've got someone who's established where they are, they know what their limiting factors are, can you reel off a few specifics, what they can look out for now?
Every business is different, and understanding the makeup and drive behind that business is very important to be able to build any sort of sensible action plan. However, I always think that whenever you're talking about growth and trying to suggest different options that a business might be able to take, if you don't actually give some sort of context or things to consider behind it and just talk high level about how you might, say, increase sales, then it doesn't deliver a lot of value to the listener. So if I try and run through a few different key areas that typically we see are limiting growth for our clients and some of the ways you may be able to deal with it, hopefully it gives a little bit of a flavour of different options and things that you might want to think about behind the scenes.
Fab, thank you.
So if I start with sales, which is a very common one, how do I grow my sales? There's lots of different avenues you might take that. You might want to consider your current pricing and your pricing structure. You might consider the variety of products you're offering and where that sits within your marketplace. It could be the quality of products, whether that's over quality or under quality. It could be looking at marketing and advertising. It could be upskilling your sales team or whoever's actually in charge of sales within the business. If we look at people, which is another key area, it might be that you want to consider how you're actually incentivizing the existing employees and whether they're aligned to your objectives. It might be whether there is an issue with existing staff and onboarding new staff, or whether there is an opportunity to reallocate management resources to realign the current resource of people you have. It could be looking at alternative locations for workforce to attract a larger workforce, and that could now be remote or overseas. It could be looking at the work style of the staff or the process they undertake. All of these might help reduce the burden on a people-related limiting factor. If we look at cash, then I'd always recommend considering the payment terms you give your customers and also the payment terms you receive from your suppliers. Both of those might be able to be supported to reduce the cash flow burden. Ultimately, a lot of that comes down to time. So how long does it take you to actually complete your product or service and get it out the door and get paid for it? If you can reduce that time window, then you're likely to have better cash control. It could be looking at debt or different ways you're actually raising finance within the business. It could be how you're extracting cash from the business or whether you are at all. If your limiting factor is around the process that you undertake, then key areas to consider are actually what wastes are in that process, both in terms of time and costs. And by waste, I mean things that you could eliminate and still deliver the same result. It could be looking at automation or AI and how you can perhaps invest in equipment, whether that's digital or otherwise, to support the process. It could be upskilling teams or upskilling your existing resource. Or if we focus more on back office within that, have you got too much admin and red tape in your current processes? Could you outsource more to free up time to focus on the areas that you want to? Is it slow decision making, probably caused by lack of quality information or not knowing where the business currently sits to decide how to move forwards? Or could it just be unaware of what others or competitors are doing in the marketplace? Most of these we've briefly talked around today, but they're key areas that for some people hopefully will spark a few thought processes of this might be a way actually that can help drive real results.
There's so many, isn't there? So many things that people need to consider. And I suppose giving yourself the time, allocating a bit of time to look through all of those areas will be really important, won't it, to achieve your growth going forward. So yeah, thank you, Will. That's a really useful list.
No problem. And I think it's also worth considering that there's loads of different things you can do with a business or change to try and help deliver growth. And some will deliver more success than others. And that will vary from business to business. And the biggest advice we can help support people with is which of these actually is likely to impact my business the most, because everyone would benefit from more sales. But if that actually isn't the biggest limiting factor on your business at the moment, then would you be better off allocating that time, that limited time you do have, to focus on another area that might enable you to deliver much higher growth?
That definitely makes sense. So, Will, I'm going to put you on the spot now. We've started a little trend with the other episodes by doing a 3 top tips wrap up. So, for any business that is starting to think more about growth, they're becoming more and more established, what would you say to them would be the 3 main things to think about initially?
Good question. I would say, first of all, understand where you are. So know where the current position of the business in as much detail as possible so that you know where you're growing from. Then set your target of where you're trying to grow to. What is your forecast and budget? How analyzed does that go into details? And why have you actually come up with those numbers? What's the motivation behind it? If you find that you're not actually motivated for that growth, then why are you trying to do it to start with? Pick something that does motivate you, and probably an area. I'm already going off on a tangent here, Alanah. Sorry, but probably an area that we haven't yet talked about is that as accountants, we massively focus on financial growth and financial results. But it might be that for your business, what you're actually interested in is something non-financial. It could be the amount of people you're helping or supporting or interacting with. It could be the number of staff that go home with smiles on their faces. It could be that you want to grow by your reputation in the marketplace, or how big you are in terms of who knows who you are and what you do, whether you're on national TV or whether you're a small business that only the people on the same road as you have heard of. So there are lots of different things that can drive results. We just always inherently focus on the numbers because we're bean counters. I think that I've done 2. So my third, if I have to do one, would probably be actually then chunking that down, sharing the weight of that responsibility by sounding somebody out, whether that's professional support or otherwise, and actually saying, this is what I want to focus on. What do you think? Does this sound sensible to you? So they would be my 3 biggest takeaways for anyone trying to drive home growth in their business.
Perfect. Thanks, Will, for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
If you would like to get into contact with us and find out a little bit more about your growth strategy, all of the details are within the show notes.
Thank you for joining us for Larkin Gowan Insights, Accountancy and Business Advice for All. Don't forget, you can find more information about today's topic and more about how our team of experts can help you in your business by visiting our website, larking-gowan.co.uk. Join us again next time for another fascinating insight into the world of accounting and finance.